Okay, well, thank you everybody, and good morning everyone. Welcome to this UKAS and BEIS Green Homes Grant webinar. My name is Matt Gantley and I'm the Chief Executive of UKAS. I'm delighted that you've been able to join us today, and I see a number of familiar names and organisations on the call, plus some new ones, so welcome to you all. I'm sure that you don't need reminding that there has been a lot of interest in the Green Homes Grant Scheme, and it was very good news to hear that this has been extended to March 2022. Therefore, we're pleased to be working in partnership with BEIS to support this very important initiative. This webinar is aimed at certification bodies already accredited or considering accreditation to PAS 2030 in connection with the Green Homes Grant Scheme. And we are hosting this webinar in conjunction with BEIS, who've asked us to give a run through of the requirements of PAS 2030 and ISO 17065. It may cover areas that you're already familiar with, but it will also give you an opportunity to ask questions and refresh your memory. The webinar will be led by Janet and Dave Compton from UKAS, and also on the call is Hugh Taylor, the External Affairs Director. The webinar should last around 2 hours with a breather at 11 o'clock. Excuse me. So this session will be interactive, giving you an opportunity to ask any questions in the Q&A session. So at this point, I'd like to pass over to Janet. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the session.
Thanks very much, Matt, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. I'm very pleased to be here, very pleased with the attendees. I just wanted to run through a little bit of webinar etiquette before we get going. We are using Zoom, and you will be muted for the duration of the webinar. We take questions. If I might ask you to put them in the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll take questions at the end. So please use, but you can submit questions at any time. We are recording today's webinar for those unable to attend in person. So thanks very much for following this protocol. If you've got any questions or queries, put them in the Q&A. So without more ado, I'll move on to the webinar. So my name is Janet Gascoigne. I'm a development manager at UKAS. I'm also a trainer for ISO 17065. We run a training course for that, which is a 2-day course. I obviously can't run through all of that today. So what we are going to do is give an overview of ISO 17065 requirements, but focusing on those parts that are particularly relevant for PAS 2030 certification, which underpins the Green Home Grant Scheme and indeed ECO. And we're going to be looking, as well as at PAS 2030, also at PAS 2031, the 2017 version and 2019 version. And also spend a bit of time focusing on requirements for making an application for accreditation. We're aware that there's interest from bodies that aren't already accredited for PAS 2030 in applying, but also for extensions to scope. And a little bit on the assessment process. I'm really pleased to be able to do this today, to try and sort of facilitate bodies that want to apply for accreditation or extensions to scope, just run through some of the key areas using ISO 17065 as a basis. As I say, we can't focus on everything in ISO 17065 in this webinar, so some of it we will pass swiftly over, others we'll spend more time on looking at a little bit more detail. So just to refresh the memory of those who are familiar with this, or for new bodies, this is the structure of ISO 17065, which is very similar to any other conformity assessment standards you might be familiar with. So we have the foreword, which sets the scene, the ISO scene, and then an introduction, which puts the standard in context. Then we have the scope, normative references, which is the standards that are referred to within the standard, terms and definitions, and then the actual requirements start at clause 4, clauses 5 to 8, and we'll run through those very, very quickly, but pick out some of the key elements that are relevant to PAS 2030 certification. And there's also a couple of informative annexes at the back of the standard, just so you've got an overview of the structure. So what is ISO 17065 for? This is taken from the introduction to the standard. The aim of certification, any certification, is to give confidence to all interested parties. In this case, that a product, process or service fulfills specified requirements, the scheme that's referred to throughout ISO 17065. In this case, installation of measures through PAS 2030. And we'll talk about PAS 2030 a lot more later. And this underpins certification to PAS 2030, underpins the Green Home Grant Scheme. And also in the introduction, they just note that 17065, the requirements are intended to ensure that certification bodies operate certification schemes. There are three main topics, which those of you that have heard me speak on the 17065 course will know that we emphasise a lot. 3 threads really running throughout the standard, which is competence, consistency and impartiality. So those are the 3 elements that I'll be focusing on in today's webinar. So moving on to the scope, which is clause 1, again, it reiterates that the scope of this standard is requirements for the competence, consistent operation and impartiality of product, process and service certification bodies. So those 3 key elements. Doesn't set the requirements for the scheme itself, although it does refer to the scheme a lot all the way through ISO 17065, but there are no specific requirements. It's non-scheme specific. In this case, we're looking at several PASs, PAS 2030, PAS 2031, PAS 2035, and any other scheme requirements there may be associated with the scheme, such as the Green Home Grant Scheme. And we'll talk more about those PASs a bit later on. And just a reminder in the scope, certification of products is a third-party conformity assessment activity. So the certification body is independent from the organisation and the product, process or service that they're certifying. Although of course anybody can use any standard as they wish, but certification is most definitely third party. So the first, moving on to that, we're actually digging into the requirements now. So just run through what's in clause 4. I'm not going to cover all of that today. We haven't got the luxury of the time to do that. So the clause 4 deals with legal and contractual matters, the legal entity of the certification body and its agreement with its clients, use of licenses, certificates and marks, management of impartiality, liability and financing, non-discriminatory conditions, confidentiality and publicly available information. And I'm going to just pick out, which won't be a surprise to any of you, I'm sure, I'm just going to pick out impartiality, one of those 3 pillars that underpin the whole of ISO 17065. And just, this is a reminder for certification bodies and for new bodies considering applying. This is something to really think about from the outset, is the impartiality and the requirements. I won't go through them in detail, but the requirements cover the risks to impartiality from the certification body's activities and from relationships it may have with its personnel may have. So it covers the whole gamut of risks to impartiality, not just from the organisation itself, but from those of the people that work for it in whatever capacity. And it includes threats from consultancy, which are obviously a threat in terms of assessing one's own work, and it's consultancy on the part of the certification body, but also from other bodies. It also covers things like marketing together, consultancy and certification, and there's clauses dealing with all of those. And there's an overarching requirement that the certification body shall not let commercial, financial or other pressures compromise impartiality. So this is something for all certification bodies, whether they're existing or new, to think about at all times. And have they, in this case, considered this for PAS 2030 certification? So does it impinge on any other activities that the certification body does itself or that related bodies do? And this is really something as well, if a certification body is already accredited perhaps for something else and is considering moving into PAS 2030 certification, have they considered the impartiality considerations associated with it, aligned with what else they do? And we'll come back to this when we talk about the mechanism for impartiality in just a few moments. So clause 5 then is still talking about the structure, the organisation of the certification body, and it has two bits to it really. First of all, organisation structure and top management we'll talk about first, and this has a list in it of roles and responsibilities for which the certification body needs to identify someone that has overall authority and responsibility for them. And the one I wanted to pick out today, clause 513D, is responsibility for development of certification activities. And this is really important, whether it's a new certification body or an existing one applying for extension to scope in a different area. This is something when we're assessing this as UKAS, we're looking to see how has the certification body developed their PAS 2030 certification activities. For example, any certification requirements associated with it, how are they going to evaluate the new activity, have they involved the relevant stakeholders, how have they identified them, because they can bring technical knowledge as well as advising on impartiality. And has the impartiality mechanism referred to in the next bit of the standard been involved, because they can advise on the implications for impartiality of this new activity. And this information needs to be supplied with the certification body's application. So we'll come on to the AC1 form. You can find it on our website a bit later, that all bodies need to send in when they apply. And that asks for information about the considerations of the impartiality. So that information needs to be supplied, whether it's an extension to scope or a new organisation. So something to bear in mind when you're considering moving into a new activity. And then I've mentioned a couple of times the mechanism for safeguarding impartiality. This mechanism, what is it? Typically, it's a committee. People tend to talk about their impartiality committee. It doesn't have to be, as long as it fulfills the same role. And what is that role? It's in providing input and advice to the certification body on the identification of risks and the perception of impartiality. So external people to the certification body, interested parties that have some knowledge of 17065, some knowledge of certification, some knowledge of the area of work that the certification does and is planning to do, can advise on those risks and perception. And have they been involved in the setting up and development of the certification body scheme for PAS 2030 certification? Has that person, when we looked at the last slide, who's responsible for development of certification schemes, have they given the mechanism the information they need to provide that input and advice? Do they understand the scheme? This is all information that we will look at when we're assessing whether it be a new certification body or an existing one going into a new area of work. Do they understand the scheme and what's being proposed? Are they familiar with ISO 17065 requirements? Otherwise, how do they know, how can they fulfill their role do they understand why they're there and what their purpose is? And ISO 17065 requires a balanced representation, that's the phrase that's used, a balanced representation of interested parties and no single interest predominating. So how does the mechanism work? I think for a new certification body, this is a really key area to concentrate and focus on right from the start of thinking about applying, because it takes time, it takes thought to set up this mechanism. And even for existing certification bodies, when they're looking at applying for an extension to scope, you need to think about, does the existing mechanism have sufficient stakeholders, the right stakeholders? Does it have sufficient knowledge of the area of work that we're planning on moving into, so that they can advise on impartiality? And this information needs to be submitted with the application. Again, it's on the form that everybody has to fill in, there's a box at the back which applicants are asked to tick that they've sent in that required information. So bear that in mind. This is something to think about right at the start of the process. So we've covered one of the main features, impartiality. Another clause in ISO 17065 is looking at resource requirements. And this is another of the key areas, key threads really, of 17065, in other words, competence. And we're going to spend quite a lot of time on this because it's obviously key, particularly, well, for all certification bodies, but when a certification body is applying for an extension to scope, that's the key area to focus on, because if they're already accredited, they've already worked through ISO 17065 and demonstrated to us that they can meet the generic requirements. So what we're looking for is how have they dealt with the new area of work, in this case PAS 2030, but how have they dealt with it? And again, two main bits, if you like, of clause 6 dealing with resource requirements: certification body personnel, which covers competence management for personnel involved in the process and contracts with the personnel, and then resources for evaluation, whether that be internal or external. So we'll deal with these in more detail now. So first of all, looking at certification personnel, and this is something, again, that whether it's a new certification body or an existing one, they need to think about how they're going to do this. Having a procedure for the management of competencies, establish, implement and maintain. And what does that need to include? The standard has a list of elements that need to be in that procedure. I'm not going to cover them all, but I'm going to cover some of the key ones. And first of all, what do they need to know? This is all functions in the certification process. So it includes evaluation personnel, but also others that do other functions, for example, making the certification decision, doing the contract review, taking inquiries. They need to be competent for what they do. And determining competence criteria is thinking about, what do these people need to know? What knowledge and skills do they need to do their job competently? And the process, this competence management process, needs to include identifying training needs and providing training if necessary, and then demonstrating competence of personnel. So this is about not just what do they need to know, but how do you know they know it? In other words, how have they demonstrated that they have that competence? And that's the essence of competence management: determining competence criteria and then evaluating whether personnel have that competence, and then monitoring that as an ongoing process, because as time goes by, requirements change, people's experience gets less relevant, and they may need more training, more bringing up to speed. So monitoring performance of competent personnel is is very important too, and keeping records of all of this, because this is something that UKAS will look at when assessing whether it's a new certification body or an existing one. This is something that we will be looking to see what records there are of the competence criteria and the demonstration of competence, all of those records, to show that that process is both established but also implemented and maintained. What is competence, I hear you ask? And in fact, that's not it's not defined in 17065, but so the definition we typically use is that in ISO 17021-1, in the definitions there, which is the ability to apply knowledge and skills to achieve intended results. So we've got knowledge and skills. What do they need to know, and can they apply it to achieve whatever the intended results may be, whether it's contract review, whether it's evaluation, whether it's review and decision, whatever their role in the certification process. So this is a really key area, again, that when thinking about applying, the certification body needs to have thought this through, have it in place, because it's something else that's required to be submitted with the application. So just want to sort of focus in, as we're mainly talking about PAS 2030 today, focus on what that might mean for when looking at going into certification for PAS 2030. So what are the competence criteria? What sorts of things might a certification body be thinking of? So PAS 2030 has a generic part, the main clauses, and it has technical annexes. So whichever ones are relevant depending on what the certification body is applying for. If they're applying for an extension to scope, it might be an additional measure, might be an additional technical annex. If it's a new certification body, they might want to apply for just one measure, or they might want to apply for several, depending on their technical knowledge and expertise. But whatever it is that they're applying for, they need sufficient competence. What for? Because they're going to be certifying installers. So they need the competence to determine the compliance of those installers with PAS 2030 requirements. And I think that's something to focus on. The certification body isn't doing the installation, but they are certifying that the installer is competent to install whatever measures they're installing in compliance with PAS 2030. And I think we'll come on to this again in a minute, but just to highlight, there's a change in approach to how competence is referenced in PAS 2030-2019 over the 2017 version, a much more qualifications-based approach in 2030-2019. You have to forgive me for all these 20s and 2030s and 2019s and 2035s. It's quite difficult to say sometimes, but I'll try my best to be to get it right. And just a reminder that there are other roles in certification apart from evaluation personnel, and all of them need to have competence defined and demonstrated and maintained. So things like contract review, decision making, and anything else, any committees, the impartiality mechanism, all the roles need to be competent for what they've been asked to do. So some more on PAS 2030. Some of you will know there are two versions extant at the moment, the 2017 version and the new, well, relatively new PAS 2030-2019, which came out in the middle of last year. And this slide is really just to note, before we go into a bit more detail, the change in title and scope between the two standards. So PAS 2030-2017 was a specification for the installation of energy efficiency measures in existing buildings. That's changed now. In PAS 2030-2019, it's still installation of energy efficiency measures, but it's in existing dwellings. So non-domestic buildings have been removed from PAS 2030 in the new version, and have added an extra measure, an extra technical annex, which is insulation in residential park homes. So I'll put this in red really just to emphasise that this is, installers need to comply with PAS 2030, and certification bodies need to check that they do. Again, we're focusing right down into PAS 2030 now, and again looking at the differences between the two versions. So PAS 2030 2017, apart from the initial clauses which all standards have about scope and technical and references and definitions, the requirements clauses start at clause 4 and they go up to clause 9. They're generic. They're about how the installer needs to operate in a generic fashion without thinking about what measures they're installing. So they're generic to all installers. And then there are a whole load of annexes at the back of the standard covering the different measures that may be installed. And those annexes cover a number of different routes to competence, including one for demonstrable knowledge and experience. They specify competence routes for building inspectors and operatives, both threshold and specialist. So, and the competence routes may differ between England and Wales and Scotland. If we look at PAS 2030-2019, we've now got an extra clause, so it's clauses 4 to 10, the generic ones now, and we'll see why that is in a minute. But they've also got relevant annexes. So we've still got the measure annexes at the back. We've got an extra one now for park homes. The other thing that's happened that's changed in PAS 2030-2019 is that the design requirements have largely been removed and moved into a new standard, which is called PAS 2035, that I'll talk about in a minute. And references to that standard have been included in PAS 2030. It's sort of like a sister standard, if you like. And competence is largely based on vocational qualifications, and we'll look at what that means in a moment. But so that the focus on competence has changed between the two standards. So more on the changes in the new standard 2030-2019. So the definition of competence and competence requirements in the definition of competence has changed, and the competence requirements have changed in the measures specific annexes. So there's now reliance on qualifications rather than demonstrated ability to apply knowledge and skills as evidence of competence. And then we work our way through the definitions in PAS 2030-2019. So the definition of vocational competence, which is in the definition section of 326, refers to vocational qualifications, and those are defined in clause 329. But the qualifications include in that definition that they include assessment of ability to deliver required outcomes through the practical applications of acquired knowledge and skills. So they do include that practical demonstration. Remember, the definition we looked at before for competence is the ability to apply knowledge and skills. So it's not just about learning, it's about being able to apply it. So that's in the definition of vocational qualifications. And then if we follow that through in that definition, it talks about the Register of Regulated Qualifications, or the RRQ, which is the repository for information on what are the relevant vocational qualifications for the particular measure or measures that the certification body wants to be able to certify against, and that the installer wants to be able to install. So that's like the sort of overarching structure for competence based on vocational qualifications. And then just to remind you that there's been the addition in this version, the new version, of measure-specific annex for insulation in park homes. So, looking at design, I mentioned that the way design is treated in PAS 2030 has changed from the old to the older to the new version. In that in clause 4 it was sorry, PAS 2030-2017 it was dealt with in clause 4, the EEM energy efficiency measures design. Now PAS 2030 has got two clauses that deal with design, but actually most of the requirements on design have moved, but this is why we've got this extra clause in the 2019 version. So the clause 4 is new. It refers to retrofit project management, and it refers to the appointment of a retrofit coordinator, a key role in installation of measures under PAS 2030 in accordance with requirements of PAS 2030-2019. So, sorry, PAS 2035-2019. It's quite a short clause, clause 4, and then clause 5 refers to retrofit design, and it refers to that design for the installation of the measure or measures complying with PAS 2035. And the installer has to be satisfied that the design is complete and suitable for the dwelling. So we keep referring to this new standard, PAS 2035. Its title is retrofitting dwellings. So it's only on dwellings, not non-domestic buildings, for improved energy efficiency specification and guidance. And certification bodies and installers therefore need to be familiar with the requirements of PAS 2035 because it's referenced in PAS 2030-2019. The installer needs to be able to be satisfied that the design is complete and suitable for the dwelling and complies with PAS 2030-2019. So just to finish off on the changes between the two standards, and I've again highlighted it's installers who need to install in compliance with PAS 2030, and certification bodies need to check that they do. And the rest of the names of the clauses haven't changed, they're just the numbers have changed from the old to the new because we've got the extra clause in there. So there's one more clause in PAS 2030-2019, but the names and the coverage in the main haven't changed. So we're still looking at competence, and I thought I would just spend a little time thinking about park homes, as this is new in PAS 2030-2019. And I think there's quite a lot of interest in possibly existing certification bodies applying for extensions to scope for this, or new applicants being interested in this. So this is an example of one of the annex specific measures in PAS 2030-2019. It's quite a big document with a lot of annexes and about a lot of information after you get past the generic stuff at the beginning. So it's Annex B13, and all the annexes have a very similar structure. So if you look at one or any of them, depending on which measures you're interested in, they all follow a very similar structure. And this one is new. Certification bodies that want to be able to certify installers for this measure need specific accreditation for this, even though the installation of the measure may involve other measures, other insulation measures, but it's treated as a specific separate measure, and certification bodies need specific accreditation on their accreditation schedule for this. And installers also need specific certification. There's an extra reference in B13.4 about room in roof insulation when talking about operative competence. And table B13 sets out the requirements for the measure. And as I say, all the measures annexes have a very similar structure. So the first part of the tables requires that installers comply with the annexes that relate to the insulation types that are being installed. So if there's different types, whatever they might be, in the park home that be installed, whether it's internal, external, loft insulation, whatever it might be, those measures and their requirements apply. As well as this standard BEIS 3632 specification for residential park homes and residential lodges. So as well as the individual measure specific annex requirements, there's also this reference in there to BEIS 3632. In the next part of the table B13, talking about pre-installation inspection, talks about, again, about the relevant measure specific annexes, and it lists them, whatever they might be, depending on what's being installed. But it also has additional bullet points. Consideration needs to be given at the pre-installation inspection stage on ventilation and thermal bridging. Then parts 3 to 6 of the table cover the competence for different activities. And then the last bit covers measures specific information to be supplied at handover of the installed measure or measures. So the structure of this annex mirrors the structure of the other annexes. But the message I'm really trying to get across is that for each measure, the installer and the certification body need to be aware of the specific details that are in that measure annex and the very specific requirements for what needs to be, not what needs to be covered, the requirements for the actual installation itself, and then the competence of those doing that installation. So remembering it's this installer that needs to be installing in accordance with this, and the certification bodies that are checking that they do. I hope that's sort of given some food for thought when we're looking at competence, looking at those competence criteria and the ways of demonstrating competence, and then thinking about what the certification body is actually planning on certifying, that they can think about these details, these very specific requirements that they are going to be requiring their personnel to be able to certify. So do they understand what it is that the installer is required to do, and are they able to certify that they actually are doing it in compliance? So just to sort of summarize that, really, installers need to comply with this, certification bodies need to have the competence to check they do, and the certification body's competence process needs to ensure this, and information on that competence process needs to be submitted with the application for either extension to scope or accreditation as a certification body. So really important to get this, think about involving the impartiality mechanism, think about involving stakeholders, think about where the technical knowledge in the certification body is coming from. Okay, so I mentioned at the start that there were 3 main themes I was going to talk about. We've talked about impartiality, we've talked about competence, and the third pillar, if you like, is process. Clause 7 is quite a long clause, so we won't go into detail about all of it. This takes about a day on the ISO 17065 course, so I'm just going to pick out some elements that the applicants for this particular activity might want to particularly think about, but obviously all the requirements need to be considered, but I'm just going to focus on a few key things. But just looking at the structure there, general requirement at the beginning for a certification body to operate one or more schemes. That's just a general requirement. The standard doesn't talk in detail about the scheme itself. It refers out to the scheme, but there needs to be at least one scheme involved. Then we're working through the process from application review, evaluation, review, and decision. So that takes us up to the point where the installer is certified, and then some other elements in the process dealing with the certification and the ongoing maintenance of certification changes, etc., and records, complaints and appeals. So I haven't got time to go through all of those today. I'm going to pick out some key elements to talk about now in relation to what we're focusing on today. So application review, and there's a lot in this clause, so I'm going to just pick out some highlights. The certification body, having got the application in from the applicant, needs to conduct a review. Why? Lots of reasons, but in this thing I want to focus on here is to ensure that they have the competence and capability to perform that activity, that certification activity. For example, if it's a new certification activity that is that's new to the certification body, have they trialed it? Have they tried it out? Have they determined that their processes work, that their competence processes work, that their processes for evaluation, for review and decision, for these new activities, do they work? Because they need to be able to present that to UKAS when we're assessing their ability to certify for that activity. So it's worth thinking about when developing a new area. Have we actually tried this out? Are we actually sure it works? Because that will be something that the certification body needs to demonstrate when they're being assessed. And 732 is an interesting one. It says the certification, very relevant here, I think. The certification body needs to have a process to identify when the client's request for certification, that's for installer, includes a type of product normative document, so that could be a standard or certification scheme with which they have no prior experience. It's something new. So it could be a new version of PAS 2030. It could be a new measure. And in those cases, so first of all, they need to know whether it's something they've not dealt with before. So this is where the competence of people taking information from inquirers, taking information at application stage, doing the application review, have they got the competence to be able to identify that this is something new? Are we going to carry on, accept the application, or are we going to say, sorry, that's not something that we've got the competence for? If they really want to go into this area of work, then they need to ensure they've got the competence and capability so they can actually resource this new activity. They need to make sure they've got that for all activities that they're required to undertake. So this is why quite often we focus on evaluation competence, but the competence to be able to deal with inquiries and applications at that early stage is also really important. So you're not accepting work and then finding at a later stage it's not something you've done before, you haven't got the competence. You either got to turn away the work or go and get that competence and be able to demonstrate it. And you will, if you want accredited certification, need to apply for an extension to scope. So still thinking about the application review, what sort of things might the review of that application need to take into account? Does the installer understand the requirements of PAS 2030? Do they know what they want? And there may need to be some discussion between the certification body and the installer about what it is exactly that the installer wants to be certified for. Does the installer understand the terms of the various easements, the various communications that have come out from BEIS over the last few months for schemes that are underpinned by PAS 2030? For example, Eco and Green Homes Grant, there have been communications that have come out about the transitions from the old to the new versions and the limitations that this might place on the installer. Does the installer understand that? Does the certification body understand that? This is key, and whether to accept the application, whether to ensure that any differences of understanding between the installer and the certification body are clarified. And which measures does the installer want? That sounds obvious, but it's really key. Is it clear which measures they want? Does the certification body have that in their accreditation already, or do they need to go and get it? Referring back to what we just talked about, so it's clear what both parties understand is going to be covered in the certification. And does the certification body have the required competence and resources? Or is development required, which it might be? And again, thinking back when we looked at clause 5, when we talked about responsibility for development certification schemes, and thinking about what was needed when moving into a different area. This again is relevant here. The installer wants measures. The certification body might be competent in some of them, but not others, but it wants to accept the application. So does it need to do some development work in their certification processes for those schemes? If they do, they need to go through thinking about competence criteria, demonstration, and so forth. And also, just a reminder that PAS 2031 that we'll talk about in a short while, which is about how certification bodies have to actually certify for PAS 2030. It actually says in clause 7 that the CB should only claim that it has the competence to certify in those areas where it's demonstrated competence. So that's sort of bound up in complying with PAS 2031 as well. And the certification body taking into account the requirements of PAS 2030, 2017 and 2019, depending on what the installer wants and the stage they're at in the transition. Are they a new organisation or are they transitioning? Which version is relevant for what they want to do, whether it's eco, green homes or something else. So the certification body might well need to refer to both versions of the standard when it's evaluating the installer. So all things to think about. We've only got to the application review at this stage. So then thinking about evaluation, this is, if you like, the nub of it, the actual doing the auditing or the evaluation of the installer. And I've just picked out here the certification body. And this is sometimes a clause that you almost sort of skip over. You think it's sort of obvious, but I think it's really relevant here. The certification body shall ensure all necessary information and documentation is made available for performing the evaluation task. So for a new activity, if this is something the certification body is moving into a new area, they've done their development work, they've done their competence criteria, they've generated all those new forms, new procedures, etc. Have they reviewed them to make sure they work? Have they trialed them? Can they show how they've decided they're appropriate? Sometimes we get applications for accreditation where we're looking at intentions rather than actually something that's actually in place. we appreciate that with a new area of work, there may not be a body of customer base out there, but the certification body should be clear in its own mind and be able to demonstrate that what it's planning on doing will actually work and has been checked, and maybe run through the impartiality mechanism, maybe be trialed, but that it's fully functional rather than sort of aspirational. And is it clear? This is important with the evaluator knowing what they're evaluating. Is it clear which version of PAS 2030 the installer is being evaluated? Is it perhaps, is it going to be both? Is it the earlier version, 2017? Is it 2019? So the evaluator needs to be absolutely crystal clear which way they're which version or versions they're looking at. So that little clause there about necessary information is really key here. And then moving on through the evaluation, I'm not going to look at all the steps in detail, but just wanted to mention non-conformities. At the end of the evaluation phase of ISO 17065, it talks about informing the client of all non-conformities. It's an interesting phrase I always think in 17065 where it talks about if the client expresses interest in continuing. So I always have this picture of the client saying that they're not interested, or are they interested? But you understand what it means. If they say yes, okay, we've got some non-conformities, but we want to carry on. We want to be certified. The certification body provides information on what other evaluation they need to do in order to close those non-conformities. But the certification body needs to be careful that they're not stepping over into that solutions mode of providing consultancy and actually telling the installer what to do. They will tell them what actual evaluation CB needs to do, but they can't tell the installer how to go about doing it, because that would be consultancy. And then when they came to certify, they would be potentially certifying their own work. There used to be a phrase in the predecessor to ISO 17065 that talked about overcoming barriers, which I think is quite a useful way of thinking of it, of being careful, provide explanations, but not solutions, not telling them what to do, for obvious reasons, because it would then be impinging and potentially a risk to impartiality. If the client says, yeah, we want to go ahead, we understand you've got to do some more evaluation, then that evaluation, whatever it might be, planning, actually doing the evaluation, needs to be done in accordance with the relevant clauses of ISO 17065 and clause 7. And I'll just put a note here to note the significance of this with the transition from PAS 2030 to 2019, 2017 to 2019. If the installer can meet 2017 but not 2019, then the certification body needs to raise non-conformities, which the installer needs to address before they can gain 2019. Certification to any standard means they meet all the requirements. And so they can't get PAS 2030, 2019 certification if they don't meet all the requirements. But in this transitional phase that we're all in at the moment, that might not be possible. So if the certification body raises non-conformities, explains what additional evaluation they need to do to close those, then the installer knows what they need to do to move on to gain their 2019 certification. But they may be able to still maintain certification or gain certification to 2017 for a short period of time until the transition from the old to the new ends. But they need to be clear what it is that they need to do to move on, if you like, from 2017 to 2019. And they need to understand the limitations that might place on them, depending on whether they want to work on eco or green homes or something else. And as I said there, meanwhile, they may be able to get 2017 certification if they meet all its requirements. So still talking about evaluation, results of all evaluation activities need to be documented prior to review. And this again is particularly relevant during this transition period from the old to the new version of PAS 2030, so that the review and decision makers know for which version of PAS 2030 the certification is planned to be issued. And again, this is competences in here for the reviewers and decision makers. Do they understand the two standards and what the differences are? And there's the information there for them to be able to tell what's been evaluated and what the requirements are in terms of certification. And it's also important that all of this is documented, all the evaluation activities are being documented so that they're recorded, so that the installer can complete the transition at a later date if they go on to fulfill all the requirements of PAS 2019. What has the certification body assessed? What did they raise? What were the non-conformities? What were they told the installer that they need to do? All that information needs to be recorded somewhere, so that if at a later date, when we come to review and decision, perhaps for 2019 version, that the review and decision makers have got that information there. So this documenting results of evaluation activities is always important, but it's really important during this transition phase that we all know where we are. And then review, we mentioned it already. The review and decision stages in 17065 are dealt with as separate clauses, but they can be done together. It can be the same person. It allows both. But they have to be independent of the evaluation, and their role is to review all information and results related to evaluation, and again need to be competent. So going back to when we talked about competence for all roles in the certification process, that includes reviewers and decision makers. Do they have the necessary expertise? Might not need to be the same technical expertise, that the certification might need to consider that, but they need to know enough to know what they're looking at. Does it provide sufficient evidence such that certification can be granted for the scope that's proposed? Are they familiar with both versions of PAS 2030 and PAS 2031, because that deals with the certification body and how it certifies? They need to be familiar, or they may need to be familiar with both, because depending on what's being planned, what stage the installer's at. So all of this competence works its way right through the whole process of accreditation. So we just finish off the process stage of the standard, and then we'll take a quick comfort break. So just moving on from review to decision. The decision maker again needs to be aware of the PAS 2030 transition and any easements in place. And with issuing the certificate, again, it's always important, but it's very important at this stage to pay special attention to what's on the certificate and the dates on the certificate, because of all the transitions, the deadlines, the different versions, obviously all the different measures. The wording is important. The reviewer and the decision maker and the person issuing the certificate need to be aware of, just pay particular attention to that in this case. And the Directory of Certified Products, which is a requirement for all certification bodies, about information on certified products. And then obviously products covers processes and services. This is all about clarity, it's about openness, it's about transparency, it's about everybody being aware of which installers are certified for what. Again, really important in this case, so that users of the certification can check, if they want to, what the installer is actually certified for, which version of the standard, what the dates are. At the minimum, the certification body is required to provide information about validity of the given certificate, but that transparency of information, always important, but particularly here, so people know exactly where they are, what the client, the installer, is certified for. Then we look at surveillance, if it's required by the scheme. It's not all product certification schemes require surveillance, but if it does, or if there's a use of a mark, then surveillance is required, and the certification body needs to cover that as required by the scheme. And again, if that surveillance uses evaluation, review and decision, all the requirements that are in 17065 that we've just talked about in clauses 7.4 to 7.6 are relevant again. So basically going around the loop of evaluation, review and decision again. And the transition is key here with surveillance as installers come up for their surveillance as part of their maintaining their PAS 2030 certification. The transition and the various dates is important, so the certification body needs to be aware of those. Where is the certification body in its process of transition, and how is that affected about the surveillance, and noting the requirements that are in PAS 2031 for surveillance. It deals with both initial and surveillance, so we'll talk about that after the break. And just finishing off with process changes. Again, changes, lots of changes going on at the moment in this whole certification activity. So if the scheme introduces new revised requirements, which of course is the case here where the PAS has changed, it's the certification body's responsibility to communicate that to their clients and verify that they've implemented the changes. And again, when the specification changes as it has with PAS 2030, that's important. And the certification body, any other changes that might occur that the client might tell them about, they need to decide what they're going to do about it. Just briefly on termination, reduction, suspension, what we might call sanctions. So if there's a non-conformity determined, it might be through surveillance or otherwise. If the installer is already certified, the certification body needs to think what they're going to do about it. And again, the transition here is really important. If they're certified to PAS 2030-2017 and the deadline for transition passes, the certification will be withdrawn unless the installer can meet the requirements of PAS 2030-2019. So PAS 2030 has a deadline next year when it will cease to be current, and at that point, if the certification is only to that standard, then it will cease to be valid. And we talked about appropriate action on the part of the certification body. And again, if that involves evaluation, review, decision, they need to be done as the standard requires. Records are important and why? To demonstrate that the certification process requirements have been fulfilled. So there need to be sufficient records to show that, basically. And it might be so that when UKAS is assessing the certification body, they've got the records available to show why they did what they did, when they did it, etc. And this is again really relevant during this transition that we're in at the moment, where the certification body will need to check what they've assessed, what more they need to do if a client is in that sort of transition between the old and the new versions of the standard. So records, again, always important, but really relevant here that they're clear and accessible, so everybody, the certification body, knows where they're going next and what's been done. Records always need to be kept confidential, transmitted, etc., so that they're kept confidential. Some schemes have a recertification cycle. If they do, then the retention period is at least the current and the previous cycle. Otherwise, it's for the certification body to define how long they keep their records for. But bearing in mind, they need to retain records for long enough to show that they followed the certification process. So the certification body might need to think about how long they need to keep those records, particularly if there's a query in the future. Have they got the records to show what they did? And I'll come back, I'll move on. I suggest we all take a 5-minute break and go and get a cup of coffee, stretch our legs, and we'll return. I've got 11:10 on my watch, so if we come back at 15:15, we'll finish off the last slides and then we'll move on to questions. So thanks very much, and we'll speak soon. Hello, we're back. I'll just give them another minute in case anyone's not finished making their coffee. Okay, we'll just move on then now. So just to wrap up 17065, the structure of it, having dealt with competence, impartiality and process, there is a section at the back that talks about management system requirements. And like all the 170 series, it gives certification bodies an option whether they want to have a management system as specified in the standard or one that's in accordance with ISO 9001. But whatever sort of management system it is, it needs to be capable of supporting and demonstrating the consistent fulfillment of the requirements of this international standard, this standard being ISO 17065. So basically the requirements for a management system are the same in either option A or option B. It's just the way of demonstrating it is referred to differently, but the outcome is the same, that consistent fulfillment of the requirements of ISO 17065. And then just briefly mention the annexes. We've got principles in Annex A. Both are informative, which means they've not got requirements in them. And the principles, they're not requirements, we wouldn't raise any findings against them, but they can help illustrate the thinking behind the clauses. So particularly, I think the impartiality one is quite useful just to read through the sorts of intentions that were behind the standard, but they are only principles. Likewise, Annex B just deals with the fact that 17065 deals with certifications of product, process and services. So they're all in the, it's just very briefly deals with that. So I just wanted to move on to a few sort of associated topics around the whole PAS 2030 certification activity and mention a PAS 2031, which is the standard for the certification bodies. So it's certification of energy efficiency measures installation, and its name has changed to mirror the change in PAS 2030. So it's only applicable to dwellings now, and it also refers to park homes. So that's one of the main reasons for the changes, also in terms of reference of retrofit design. And then they've jiggled around with the tables in PAS 2031 now. So where there were 2, there are now 4. And the so what was table 2 is now table 4, the measure inspection tier allotment of an inspection distribution. So it's been amended to refer to park homes as does PAS 2030. The table that was table 1 is now table 3. It is inspection rates by tier, and we've got 2 new tables. That's why the numbering's changed: a risk assessment and an inspection rate resulting from risk assessment. So when I was talking about competence of the certification body, they need to be aware of what PAS 2031, whatever the version is, what it says, because it specifies in some detail what they need to do when certifying installers to PAS 2030, and so the reviewers, the evaluators, the application reviewers, the decision makers all need to be aware of what's in there to make sure, for example, with a reviewer and a decision maker, when they're looking at all the information, does it cover everything? Has it got everything in there that it needs to? And on an ongoing basis, because as 17 knows, I'll come back to that, as PAS 2031 talks about both initial and surveillance and what the certification body needs to do. So the structure hasn't really changed. The numbers and the names of the clauses are still the same. So as with all standards, the first bits are the same: forward, introduction, scope, references, definitions, and then we've got those clauses on general requirements, evaluation requirements, non-conformities, scope and competency of certification bodies, and claims of conformity. So that hasn't changed. But if we look at some of the detail, and again, this hasn't changed between the two standards. I've just highlighted a few things to remember. Initial evaluation covers the process and delivery at location of the installation, and so does surveillance. So it looks at the process, the installation process, and the delivery. Table 3's got inspection rates. As I said before, we've got two new tables, 1 and 2, and table 4's inspection rates by measure. And UKAS will be checking that certification bodies have met these rates when they're doing their surveillance, and justify why, if not. What is the effect of COVID? And we all know that's affected everything we do at the moment, as it has us at UKAS. UKAS has got a lot of information on our website. I've put the link there about how we're approaching what we do, but also what we expect from certification bodies in terms of telling us what they're doing. And it's all about justifying the approach that's been taken. So we know that there are difficulties at the moment, but on the other hand, going right back to the scope at the beginning of this presentation, when we looked at what certification is for, it's all about giving confidence. So the certification body, if it's maintaining certification or issuing certification, needs to be sure it's got enough information and evidence to be confident it can issue that certificate, which is should be able to give confidence to the end user in the compliance of the installer with the requirements. So whatever the certification body's approach to this at any time, but particularly at these difficult times, it needs to be able to justify why it thinks it's going to get enough information from whatever it's planning on doing to justify maintaining or issuing certification. And if 5.3 covers evaluation of process management, and that again applies to initial and surveillance, and evaluation of client service capability. So all of those were in the old version, and then they're still in the new version of PAS 2031. And then when we look at non-conformity and types, 6.1 deals with types of non-conformity, but 6.2 action in the event of non-conformity. So this is harking back again to what I was saying about the transition. All non-conformities need to be closed before initial certification. So if they're not certified at the moment, they need to close all the non-conformities before they can get certified. If they're already certified and non-conformities are identified, then they need a specific time frame in which to close those non-conformities before it's either suspended or withdrawn. And just again, note the transition requirements. So for PAS 2030-2019, if an installer's applied for that and there are non-conformities raised against the 2019 version, they need to be closed before certification can be granted. But the installer may be able to meet PAS 2030-2017 if they meet those requirements. So this is why when I'm talking again about competence, the certification body it might need to be aware of what both those standards say, so it can evaluate the client and say, well, actually, you can't at the moment meet PAS 2030. There's some non-conformities still outstanding, but you can meet PAS 2030-2017, and we can issue a certificate for that if that meets your requirements. But again, bearing in mind the various requirements of different schemes, the certification body and the installer need to be sure that it is relevant to still issue a certificate to PAS 2030-2017. So that was PAS 2031. And just to finish off, some things to think about when applying for accreditation, and this applies not just to new certification bodies, although it obviously does, but also when extension to scope. What scope is being applied for? It may sound obvious, but the certification body needs to think about this. If they're a new certification body, what measures do they want to apply for to be able to certify for those measures? Because they need to be able to demonstrate they've got a competence for those measures. So the wider the scope that's applied for, the more work those certification bodies can do. So thinking about the application review and what whether they can accept or not the application. If they've got the accreditation, they can accept that work. If they haven't, then they're going to have to do some development work and apply for an extension scope. But obviously, the wider the scope applied for, the more effort and assessments required, both from the certification body, because they've got to have competence for those measures, and from us when we're assessing the certification body. So it's a balancing act, really, for the certification body to think about what is their skills set, what markets do they want to be in, what's the demand, what work do they need to do if they've not got the competence already, and really think about it when they're thinking about applying for accreditation. And just a reminder about park homes, there does need to be a separate accreditation for that. And again, the certification body needs to think about if they want that, they need the competence to do it, and they need to include all that in their application. And there's some key things often missed. Have you filled in all the forms? Again, as UKAS, we love, you know, everybody loves a nice form to fill in. There's a lot of information on the website about this, really helpful stuff about how to apply. If you look at the section on application forms, it talks you through it, what forms to fill in, and it's slightly different for initial applications for new certification bodies to existing ones. If it's new, they need to fill in the UKAS agreement and the application form, as well as what's called an AC1 form. If you look on our website, you see there's a list of AC forms, depending on whether you're a lab or an inspection body or whatever the activity that you want to do. The relevant one for certification is the AC1 form. And if you're applying for an extension to scope, you need to fill that in as well. So everybody needs to fill in an AC1. If you're initial, you've got a few more forms to fill in. If it's extension to scope, you've already done that. So the key is the AC1 form. And that's what tells us what you want to be accredited for, what you're applying for, so that we can then use that information to start planning what we need to do to assess you. But I think it's really important to just check that everything that's required's been submitted. Remember the supporting information. There's a section at the back of the AC1 form with a little box, a little table with supporting information, and quite often, not quite often, sometimes we'll have an application where those boxes have been ticked but the information's not there. And the trouble is that if the application is not complete, we just have to go back and ask for that information. If it's not been submitted, it can't be assessed. Sounds obvious, but it does cause delays. So it's really worth having just a review before you submit your application, that everything's in there that's been requested. Or if it hasn't for some reason, then at least say why and that it's coming within a week or two or whatever. But the more information you send us at the beginning of the process, the quicker we can move through the process, the quicker we can do our contract review, the quicker we can get on and get that assessment through. So it's worth putting in the thought and the effort before submitting that application in. So just remember the design process we talked about, the impartiality information, the competence, information and the procedures. All that information, it's there in the AC1. It sort of helps you to, as an aid memoir. Have you thought about it? Have you sent it all in? As I say, if it's not there, we can't assess it. So it's really important. Just to sort of, for those of you not familiar, those of you already accredited will be familiar with this, but just for those who maybe aren't so familiar with our process of assessment, the first step is obviously the certification body sending in an application with that supporting information. They might want to give us a ring or drop us an email just to, if there's anything they want to talk through. But also, as I say, on the website, there's loads of information about how to apply, really helpful stuff. And then when we get that application, we'll check it's complete. So we'll look for, is there information that we've asked for? We'll do, if it's a new body, we do various checks on the organisation. If the information has not been submitted, then we'll have to go back and ask for it. And then we do our contract review. This is equivalent to the application review in 17065. And basically what's been applied for, have we got the competence, have we got the resource, what effort do we need to do, and basically figure out what effort, assessment effort we need to do. New applicants can, if they wish, choose to have an optional pre-assessment, and we do recommend this, but it's not obligatory. The idea of that is it's well, what it says, a pre-assessment, and no non-conformities are raised, but it's an initial look at the processes and procedures of the applicant, so that if there are any key showstoppers in there, they can be highlighted at an early phase. Obviously, we can't tell the applicant what to do to put it right, but we can highlight that there are some areas that need addressing, because otherwise, when we start the assessment itself, if those issues crop up, that's going to delay things. So pre-assessment useful, but not obligatory. Then we always start, we're basically building up a picture of competence of the certification body to meet the requirements of 17065 and the relevant scheme, in this case, PAS 2030 certification. So we start with looking at the documented management system, the processes and procedures in place, because if they're not, there's not really much point in going on, because there's gaps in the requirements of 17065. And then we move on to the head office assessment, when we actually, in normal circumstances, visit the certification body at its premises, talk through all those documents and procedures and processes, talk to people, figure out how they've actually implemented the certification activities, and then we'll do one or more witness assessments depending on the scope applied for. This is when we go out with the evaluator, if they go out on site, and actually sit with them, watch them, don't interfere, but just watch as a basically an ultimate demonstration of all the evidence of the picture of competence we've been building up over the assessment, that can a competent evaluation be done as evidence of the working of the process. And obviously at the moment, all of this process is being affected by the coronavirus. And I would point you again to the pages on our website about how we're going about assessing during the pandemic, because it's not at the moment always going to be possible to actually go and on site. So there's a lot of information there, and we will discuss that with the certification bodies on an individual basis as to what we're planning on doing and what they're planning on doing. Just following on then from doing the evaluation, the assessment, the assessment team comes up with a recommendation, which is then moved on to again, a bit like the review and decision making process in 17065, we have a similar stage of decision making process, hopefully leading to grant of accreditation, and issue a certificate if it's a new applicant. And everybody has an accreditation schedule or schedules on our website, publicly available, that lists in precise detail exactly what the certification body is accredited for. And if it's an extension to scope, we'll update that the new measure or measures. And then everybody then is on an annual surveillance and 4-year reaccreditation cycle. And just a reminder, really, why do we do all that assessment process? What is it for? Is to see that the certification body complies with ISO 17065 and has the competence to certify for particular schemes. So think about that when you're sending in your application and when we're assessing you. Have you provided us with enough evidence to be able to make that judgment and grant the decision? And just when doing the assessment, we sometimes find a lack of readiness. As I said before, we can't assess good intentions. We can't assess this is what we're planning on doing. We need to see actual evidence of that you're either doing it or that you've trialed it and you've got processes and procedures in place. Not that we're planning on having the processes, but we haven't got them yet. And sometimes, hopefully, when we've been through all that documentation, we won't get as far as that before we get to head office. But it just all adds delay. So think about what we need to see in order to be able to accredit certification bodies, and missing information. And they're particularly relevant with the transition for PAS 2030, with a different approach to competence and qualifications now coming to the fore, thinking about those definitions of competence and what the qualifications are. Has the certification body looked at its competence process that perhaps was devised for PAS 2030-2017 and mapped the new requirements to its process? We sometimes see that always hasn't been done or not in sufficient detail. And then lack of records, again, of competence. Has the certification body satisfied itself that its personnel meet the requirements of the relevant standard? If these things are missing, they all delay things. So this is really about making things as streamlined as possible and not holding up accreditation, which obviously we all want to facilitate as much as possible, whilst making sure that installers are competent to install the measures. So I think that's the end of the slides. Yes, it is. So I'm going to stop talking for a bit, which you may or may not be pleased to hear, and hand over to to Hugh, my colleague Hugh, External Affairs Director, who's going to facilitate the question and answer. We'll try and answer as many questions as we can get to. I've also got my colleague Dave Compton from the development section on the line. I'm not sure if our colleague from BEIS is on the line at the moment. If there's any question that we need an input from BEIS from, we'll either ask him or take them away. And again, if there's any other questions that we can't answer at the moment, we'll take them away and come back with a response. So Hugh, relieve me from talking for a minute, and I'll have a drink of water.
Well, it's probably only going to be for a minute, Janet, because quite a few questions come in.
Okay.
So I'll be handing back to you quite shortly, but thank you for those that have come in. I think the ones we've had mostly, particularly from Nigel Donoghue, from Jerry Miller and Danny Putney, are largely to do with the transition, the 27 and 2019 situation. Mm-hmm. I think you may have already answered some as you've gone along, particularly question regarding whether or not an installer can be certified to, I suppose they've applied for 2019, they don't quite meet 2019, but they've met all the requirements for 2017, and therefore can they be certified against that? And I think you've answered that to say that they can. Yeah. But please come in there. I'm also, because I think we're quite a small group this morning, I think it's going to be okay for people to turn on their microphones, perhaps to ask their questions. So Nigel, I think I'm going to ask you in just a second to come in, because you had a question around that, but also to do with the easements in connection with ECO. I don't think Elliot Roof from BEIS is on the call at the moment. He was on earlier, but he wasn't when I looked a minute ago, so he's not unfortunately able to answer from a BEIS point of view. But Nigel, do you want to just come in if you can and sort of repeat your question regarding easement?
Thank you. I've just seen I can now unmute my mic. Just sorry, Hugh, can you hear me?
I can hear you okay, yes, carry on.
My computer went into a test mode for some reason. No, I've just got a concern, because it flies in the face a little bit, Janet, with regards to the debate we've recently had about installers being certified to 2017 and being able to lodge under ECO. We've got some installers, a number of installers who've got more than one cert body for the same measure, and I'm really concerned that should an installer get to the end of their 2019 transition period, where they should be 2019 and lodging to 2019, they then go to another cert body, they achieve a level of non-compliance, they get 2017 and they continue to expand their life lodging under 2017 under ECO. I hope the intention is not to permit that to happen.
Well, yes, Nigel, you're absolutely right. We have discussed this, and I have to say that any of the issues relating to easements are really not in the gift of UKAS; they're in the gift of BEIS, and depending whether it's ECO or Green Homes Grant, then the different people dealing with that. My understanding is that the ECO easement has effectively ended now, and that so the requirements are different. And this is why I sort of emphasise about knowing what is in those easements and making sure that the installer does too, so they're not ending up with something that then isn't fit for what they want to do. And it's being aware of what those easements say. And for me, the sort of key reference point is what's in those easements. So, but it's important that the certification bodies are aware of them and make their clients aware, because I think as someone said at the round table a week or so ago, what certification bodies do is certify to PAS 2030, and it's then for the installer to be aware of what they want to actually do with that certification and which schemes they want to be able to install under. So the requirements are different, and both parties, the installers and the certification bodies, need to be aware of that and make sure that everybody understands the difference. And if needs be, check it with the regulator, with BEIS.
All right, Janet, that the easements are only for a certain period, so even if they met to 2017, the organisation would have to move to 2019 in a relatively short period of time anyway. Yes,
Dave, that's absolutely right. And what we're not clear about, because as Matt mentioned at the beginning, this really welcome extension of the Green Homes Grant. We haven't. That's something that we need to. I think all of us need to talk through with BEIS as to what effect that has on the transitions and the various deadlines. But we need to have that. We need to have that discussion. Hugh, you're muted.
I've just seen that. There's a nice little message up on my screen telling me I was muted.
Yeah.
But if it came up 2 seconds before I spoke, that would be much more useful.
Yeah. But it's a new vocabulary, isn't it? It is, yes. You're on mute, and a legacy hand is the other one. When people put their hands up.
I'll keep my legacy hands out of sight. I'm going to bring Danny in, because as she's just pointed out in the Q&A, her question was slightly different. So Danny, if you want to unmute, you want to just come in and ask your question about holding both certifications concurrently?
No. It's about holding it's about holding both of them at the same time. We've been for organisations that were registered with us already, And then when Green Home Grant requirement come in, so they'd been 2017, transitioned to 2019, and then the Green Home Grant voucher scheme came in and said work to 2017. We've confirmed they're compliant with that still, and then issued both. And then we were challenged last week that they shouldn't have 2 certifications.
Yeah, this is an interesting one, Danny. I mean, again, my sort of Bible in all of this is looking at what the communication that came out on the 28th of August said, and I think this is dealt with in points 1 and 2, which is about installers that have transitioned either before or after when this statement came out. But it says they can have their superseded PAS 2017 certification recognised alongside their PAS 2019 certification, thus permitted to work in compliance with either standard and of their certification and scope from their PAS 2019 certification date until 31st of March 2021. I think that addresses it. I mean, obviously
I think so too.
Yeah, that 31st of March bit, we're not sure how that stands with this extension, but I think the principle, that's my Bible, Danny. That's what I go back to for these sort of nuances.
Thank you, Janet. I just wanted some clarification because my understanding is exactly the same as yours. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, and Jerry, you had a question as well around the sort of the having certification to 2017 if the installer had failed 2019 but still met the 17 requirements. So have we now answered that? I sort of feel we have, but I just want to make sure we have.
Morning, Jerry.
Yeah, morning. It's kind of a different side to the same coin. I think Nigel's point was very much on the risk of certification body hopping and people trying to game the system to allow low compliance cost work to be completed. I really just wanted to close off a loophole, which was where an installer has transitioned to 19, there is no chance that if they failed audit and had non-conformities but still met 2017, that they could be temporarily certified to 2017. I don't think that's legitimate, but I'd just like a bit of confirmation, really.
Well, again, I think this has been covered, that we have said where a body comes in that hasn't been certified before and wants to be 2019 certified but can't quite meet it for whatever reasons, whether it's availability of retrofit coordinators or availability of qualifications or whatever it is, they will have non-conformities raised against them, which will be extant until they close them. They can't have PAS 2019 certification till they have closed them, but they may meet the requirements of PAS 2017, in which case they can be certified to them until such time as PAS 2017, either the easement finishes or the transition period finishes, and and then they will have to meet the requirements of 2019. So I'm not quite sure what I mean about hopping between different certification bodies, because if they move to another certification body, then that will be like a new certification. So I think the sort of surveillance bit wouldn't really come in. I'm not sure if I've missed the point, Jerry. If I have, I apologise. You can try me again.
No, I think confirmation that once you are accredited to 2019,
yes,
you can't purposefully fail audit in order to trigger your earlier 2017 certification. That's the risk.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yes, yeah, but yes, I think if you've demonstrated and you can meet the requirements, then yeah, I think purposely failing would not be a good idea. I'm not sure much more I can say on that, but if there's sort of like specific instances of these sorts of things happening, we can maybe look at them and see if we tried to cover everything in that communication, but if there are still instances arising that don't quite fit the bill, I'm sure we can give them some more consideration, Jerry, if we need to.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go back now to a question that Jason Clement submitted very early on. So apologies for making you wait, Jason. If you want to come in, you were asking about PAS 2030 also allowing for ISO 17024.
Hello. Yeah, it was just we were reading through PAS 2030 earlier, and it did seem to have an allowance for 17024 rather than regulated qualifications.
Yeah, it does talk about that. You're right, Jason. It talks about it somewhere. I spotted it earlier when it's talking about 315 personal certificate of competence. Yes, I think the issue is that there's not that many. There are some 17024 schemes. ISO 17024, for anyone that isn't familiar with it, is another standard in the family of conformity assessment standards, and it deals with accreditation of certification of personnel certification bodies, where the object of conformity assessment is a person being deemed to be competent for something, and there's a whole scheme. There has to be a scheme around that. So yes, it is allowed for Jason in 315.
Thank you.
If that's available, but you know, obviously not always the case.
Okay, thank you. And then I've got one more question outstanding, again from quite early on, from Rachel Davidson. Rachel, if you want to come in, but your question was around how long does an extension to scope take?
Yes, thank you. It was just purely a practical question. We're a certification body accredited to 17065, and it was purely about timing because the Green Home Grant scheme's open till March 2022. Yes. So I just wanted to get a broad understanding that if we wanted to extend our scope, approximately how long does that take?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and particularly pertinent at the moment, especially with these deadlines. Although, as I say, we hopefully some of the pressure will be off given the welcome extension of the scheme. That's sort of why I focused on making sure the application is sort of right first time, Rachel. Because I think you know what I'm going to say. There is no sort of set length of time any of this takes. If you bear in mind what we've actually got to do to assess you, I mean, as an extension to scope can take up to 6 months. It can take as little as 3 months. It can take less than that, depending on how ready the applicant is and how complete that application is. If you think about the processes that need to be gone through, even when there's two bits, I suppose, to this. One is the readiness of the applicant. Now, they've got to put all this stuff in place, so like procedures, competence. They've got to do some work off-site, if you like, before they even come to apply. And then there's the work that we need to do to satisfy ourselves that we can accredit somebody. So we need to obviously do a contract review, we need to get the work booked in, and then we need to actually do it. And then depending on whether there are any non-conformities or not that we raise, and we obviously hope there won't be, but quite often, you know, the way things are, there are some, they need to be closed before that grant can be made. And we're very aware of that time scale, Rachel. So we're doing everything, making sure we've got resource available and primed and ready, so that if we get applications in, we can deal with them straight away. But I would say that some of the applications that we've had haven't been complete, and then that introduces delay. So that's a bit why I sort of went on about it a bit in the presentation. I'm not sure that gives you the definite answer you want, Rachel, but that's about the best I could do.
There's a couple of other factors that you might want to consider as well, is that we will need to witness you assessing or evaluating a client as well. So depending on how many clients people have got and their availability and where they are in the process, that may have an effect on timeless as well. But I think if you're already accredited, then forewarn your assessment manager. That's the point of contact at UKAS, and those discussions can start at the earliest opportunity for us to look at resourcing and discuss timescales with yourself as well.
Thank you, that was helpful.
Okay, thank you. I think we're coming up to the last 5 minutes or so. I haven't got any other questions, I think.
Hugh, sorry, there was one about competence. Both Jerry and I asked the question.
Right, carry on.
About individual, so certification bodies, what's the expectation on the level of competence? Is it equal to the competence of the installation company, the certificated company, or is it of a lesser standard? What's the UKAS view on that?
Well, that's a really good question. That's the sort of question we ask on our training course, and the answer is down to the certification body to determine. Where one of the reasons I highlighted in the presentation was it's for the installers to comply with PAS 2030, and it's for the certification bodies to check that they do. So the certification body needs to be sufficiently competent to be able to tell if the installer's doing it right, is in essence, certainly for the evaluation personnel. So the certification body might decide that in order to be able to do that, to tell whether the installer's installed a window or installed insulation or whatever it might be, how do they evaluate that, and what competence do they need? They might well decide that there needs to be the same or at least similar, but bearing in mind that they're not actually going in and actually doing the installation, they're making sure that there's a competence. So there is no one single answer to that question. It's for the certification bodies to determine the level of competence that they need, and then but bearing in mind that certificate, what is it saying? What's it giving confidence to the end user for? Is someone going to do an evaluation going to be able to assess the installation of that measure, and what competence do they need? So that's the only answer I can give you, I'm afraid. We don't sort of set competence criteria ourselves. It's for the certification body and the scheme to do that.
Okay, any more questions that we haven't covered already? Feel free to chip in. Oh, I'm hearing silence. And by the way, I keep turning my microphone off because right at this moment, I'm having some energy conservation measures installed in the house. And there is occasional drilling, which is extremely loud. So that's why I've been keeping on mute as much as possible. But if there's nothing else from anybody, any final offers? And if not, I will thank everyone for attending this morning. I hope you found it useful. We're always here separately if you want to ask anything else. And as we've said, this recording will be made available. I think we'll be probably just putting it on our website for easy access. But if any of your colleagues want to see it, it will be there for future reference. And obviously we'll make it available to BEIS as well, so if they need to use it for any of their reasons. So thank you all for attending. Thanks very much to Janet for a 2-hour monologue. And thanks to you all for attending. As I say, any further questions, please contact us separately. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.